Welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Clovis Casali in Paris, and we talk politics today. After the historic results obtained by the French far right in the European elections, some experts say it's only a matter of time before Marine Le Pen's National Front gets into power. Our guest, Éric Fassin, is one of those who believe it's inevitable, and he partly blames the Socialist Party for that. A sociologist and professor at Paris 8 University, he urges President Francois Hollande to conduct what he calls real left-wing policies, though he has little hope it will happen. We're about to see why. Éric Fassin, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
In your latest political essay called Left-Wing, A Future of Disillusionment, you offer a particularly harsh assessment of Francois Hollande's presidency. You actually go as far as to say that he's basically betrayed his electorate and the left-wing in general.
I'm afraid I'm not the only one saying that these days. I think most people have realized that, in fact, someone who was elected as a left-wing president turns out not to be one. There was an interesting moment in the beginning of 2014 when he came out as a social democrat. But in fact, what he did at the time was certainly not acknowledge that he was a social democrat. He was hiding the fact that he'd become a neoliberal. That is, in fact, he's not trying to balance the power of capital and labor. In fact, what he was doing is favoring employers, not employees, markets, and not citizens. And this, I think, is a choice, a political choice on the part of François Hollande that betrays indeed people who voted for him and who wanted, as his slogan said, change now.
Change now. And you believe there's little difference between Nicolas Sarkozy, his predecessor, and François Hollande? And that can't really be said when you look, for instance, at style and possibly also in terms of substance. Take some measures, such as the same-sex marriage. Those are measures that Nicolas Sarkozy would never have put forward.
I do point out that there's a difference in style. I compare François Hollande to a kind of Sarkozy with a human face. On the other hand, there's a question of substance indeed, and same-sex marriage was the only difference between Sarkozy's government and Hollande's administration. And I think this actually explains in part why there was so much mobilization against marriage for all. It's precisely because that's the one dividing line between right and left today in French society and politics. But if you compare in terms of economic policies or immigration policies or the treatment of the Roma in France, there's a striking continuity. Think, for example, of the summer of 2010, when Nicolas Sarkozy started attacks against the Roma. In 2012, Manuel Valls is doing exactly the same thing, even though 2 years earlier, he was criticizing Nicolas Sarkozy for doing that.
Let's talk about economic policies, for instance, and let's take a look at one pivotal moment during the presidential campaign with a particular speech where with which François Hollande managed to win over many hearts on the left. It was at Le Bourget in January 2012.
I'm going to tell you who is my adversary, my real adversary. He has no name, no face, no party. He'll never run, so he'll never be elected, although he does govern. This adversary is the world of finance.
Éric Fassin, when you look at that speech, what's your feeling? Do you have the feeling that François Hollande was lying at the time?
My suggestion is that when he says change is now, he means is now, which means it was true during the campaign, it's not true after the campaign. What is interesting is that today no one would take seriously the fact that François Hollande is the enemy of finance. It would be a joke. So first, what it means is that the words of the president have lost any value. But the second thing is that it means if there's no difference when you have a change in the majority from the conservatives to the socialists, what's happened to democracy? Democracy is about choices, alternatives. And we know that Margaret Thatcher's mantra was there is no alternative. Now, François Hollande was very cautious in saying at Le Bourget, in that very same speech, there's always an alternative. What he's saying today is there's never an alternative.
And you feel he's turned his back on that he's made no effort to try to attack the financial world as he vowed to do so before he was elected?
I think if he'd done so, someone would have noticed.
Okay, that's a clear answer. In your essay, you also speak of the concept of realism. Socialists claim it's a necessity. Can you explain to me what realism means to the ruling party? It's kind of a guiding feature for them, isn't it?
Realism is a term that emerges in the years 1980s, and in particular with the 1983 turn of the Socialist Party from socialist policies to adaptation to the market.
And at the time, Francois Mitterrand has just been elected president and Pierre Mauroy is his prime minister.
Exactly. And at the time, people thought it was temporary. But it turns out that it's been going on for more than 30 years.
And at the heart of your political essay, there's also another very interesting idea, and that is that you say that because the Socialist Party is shifting towards the centre, in fact, it's fueling the agenda of the far right. And that's why, for instance, the National Front, the Front National, did so well in the European elections, finishing for the first time ahead of all the other parties here in France. And you actually say that the Socialist Party has embraced the questions raised by the Front National, but also their answers.
It's quite striking. Actually, what we've seen is that the more realistic the socialists try to be, the more they resemble the right. But the right has to distance itself from the socialists, and therefore they have to try to imitate the extreme right. And so you have a complete shift in the landscape, in the political landscape in France. This process of imitation means that in the end, everyone is speaking the same language as the extreme right. For example, in saying that immigration is a problem, instead of saying, quite simply, of course there are problems in terms of immigration.
But surely if the socialists are turning their back on real left-wing values, as you put it, well, that should benefit to other left-wing parties, and that's clearly not happening.
You're right, and that's a question that many have been asking and that I've been trying to answer in my own essay. One would think that in the same way that the National Front benefits from its critique of neoliberal policies, well, one would expect other critics of neoliberalism to win as well. Since the National Front says UMP and PS are just one and the same, the Front de Gauche on the left could benefit in the same way. But that's not the case. Why? My hypothesis is that this ideological hegemony of the right, it also includes ideas about identity. That is, if you talk about immigration, if you talk about Islam, if you talk about the Roma, then everyone at the same time is using the language of the National Front. So in terms of economics, the National Front can say they have nothing to do with the UMP and the PS. But in terms of identity politics, of national identity politics, well, then the National Front has won the day.
But it's not just a phenomenon here in France, because you see this rise of the far right all over Europe. We saw it in the recent European elections, and notably with nationalist parties also getting better and better results, notably in the United Kingdom with UKIP. And there, it's a conservative government, not a socialist one.
You're absolutely right. I think neoliberalism encourages critics from the extreme right. However, what is interesting is to look not just at Britain, but also at Greece. What's happened in Greece in the last election? What we saw is that Syriza was benefiting from its critical position, whereas the Socialist Party was collapsing completely. Of course, there's an extreme right, but less so than in France. 3 times fewer people vote for the extreme right in Greece than they do in France, and more people vote in the elections, 13% more in Greece than in France. What it means is that if you have a choice between right and left, well, people are less tempted to vote for the extreme right or not to vote. So having an alternative is essential to democracy. And in neoliberal states today, that's what's disappearing, hence the surge of the National Front and of other extreme right movements.
And one final question. You do offer some solutions, and it seems you're a keen defender of grassroots democracy. You think that if individuals get together, then they can really achieve a lot of things. And you take the example of the religious right wing in the US and also possibly in France, who, when they got together, really did achieve interesting results for them.
What's interesting is that if we think only of governmental politics, that is elections, well, you need to have a majority. How come then you have such a strong weight of the religious right in American politics starting in the 1980s? The moral majority, the so-called moral majority, may have been moral, but it was not a majority, but it gave the impression that it was a majority. So I think the question for the left is, how can people on the left do the same thing? Give the impression that they weigh much more than they do, that they're much more numerous than they actually are, because in fact today ideas on the left are a minority. How can you give the impression that you're a majority? Even in France, there are lessons to be taken from the anti-gay marriage movement. They've managed to impose their language today, in particular in their attacks against the so-called theory of gender. How come? Well, because they've been very vocal, because they've been very determined. So the left has to think in the same way how to mobilize people around a cause and be efficient in weighing on political debates.
And surely all of those questions will be addressed or need to be addressed by the left wing here in France if they want to get re-elected, because of course we know that the French president Francois Hollande is at an all-time low in the polls with barely 25% of support. Éric Fassin, interesting talking to you. Thank you very much. Your political essay, Gauche, l'avenir d'une désillusion, it can be roughly translated as The Future of a Disillusionment, is out now and it's published by Éditions Textuelles. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. Stay tuned to France 24. More reports and more international news to follow.